And we're going to call to order the February 2018 meeting of the Finance and Administration Committee. And the first item of business is to call the order. And the roll call, please.
Richard Costigan.
Here.
Teresa Taylor.
Here.
Rob Fechner.
Good afternoon.
Richard Gillahan.
Here.
Henry Jones.
Here.
David Miller.
Here.
Lynn Paquin for Betty Yee.
Okay. All committee members are present. Next item of business is the election of the Finance and Administration Committee Chair and Vice Chair. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Taylor. No, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Taylor right now to run the election.
Okay.
So, and then you'll call on me, please.
Yeah. You got it? I'm
So, Ms. Taylor, if you would call for an election for the chair of the committee.
So I'm calling for an election for the chair of the committee, and I'd like to turn this over to Mr. Costigan.
Madam Vice Chair, I'd like to nominate Teresa Taylor for chair of the Finance and Administration Committee. I think for the last year, you have done an excellent job, and I think we've accomplished some really good work, and I think it's time for you to engage on even more than you've done before. So I would be happy to place your name in nomination for chair of Finance and Administration.
All right, thank you. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Okay. With that, Teresa Taylor has been nominated for chair of the committee. We'd like a motion to...
Yeah, I'll move that we elect by acclamation.
All right. And we have a motion and a second by Miller to elect by acclamation. And all those in favor say yay.
Aye.
Aye. Yay.
Yay.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Congratulations.
All right.
I'll switch seats for right now.
Oh, is this you?
Yeah, I'll take my Gillahan. Because I think you can do it. I think you can do this.
I think
chair.
I
Okay,
can.
then you just.
I think I can. Okay. Are we on? Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay. Okay. So next order of business is the election of the vice chair. I'd like to call on Mr. Gillahan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to nominate Richard Costigan as the vice chair of this committee. I think he's done an outstanding job over the last year as chair of the committee, and I'd like to see him continue to serve in a leadership role. Thank you.
Excellent. Do we have a nomination for Mr. Costigan for vice chair? Do we have any other nominations? Do we have any other nominations? Do we have any other nominations? No. Hearing none, I'd like to hear a motion for election by acclamation.
I move.
Okay, I have a motion from Mr. Fechner. Do I have a second? Second from Mr. Jones. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, all those opposed? All right. Mr. Costigan is the vice chair.
And we need 5 minutes.
And we need 5 minutes to get everything together. Thank you. There it is. All right, I think we're back in business. Thank you, everybody. I'm honored to be chair of Finance Committee. It's already on Twitter. That was odd. So I want to go forward with our next item, and that is our executive report. Go ahead, Ms.
Good
Sorry,
afternoon,
Charles.
Madam Chair and committee members. Charles Hisbunton, CalPERS Chief Financial Officer. Congratulations on your elections, and Member Costigan, congratulations as a Vice Chair. It's a pleasure to see both of you in the leadership role, especially for Vice Chair Costigan from experience from last year. Look forward to working with you. So on behalf of myself and the entire organization, I want to thank you, congratulate you, and look forward to working with you. Before we get started today, I want to take this opportunity to inform the committee of the enhancement to corporate supplemental income plan. This is the 457 plan. The plan is a deferred compensation plan for public agencies and schools. We intend to add a rough 457 option, and this would allow participants to save for retirement on an after-tax basis. The enhancement is consistent with recent trends in retirement plan offerings and also receiving feedback from public agencies. And this provides participants additional capacity to enhance their retirement readiness. Should add, the state already offers this through CalHR. Next, I'll provide an update on committee direction provided at the December meeting. If you recall, the Harriet Fire Protection District, which voluntarily terminated its pension contract in February 2016, has not paid a termination cost of $404,000, which was due on January 20th, 2018. On January 22nd, 2018, a final collection notice was sent to the agency, and impacted members were notified, consistent with our process. A final demand for payment was sent on February 6, 2018, providing the agency 30 days to pay amounts owed. Notification was sent to impacted members and the Harriet Fire Protection District Board as well. At this time, payment for the termination liability has not been received. We will continue to communicate with the district to resolve the delinquency. If left unresolved, in April, we will request that the committee recommend the board declare the district in default, which will require a reduction in retirement benefits. Before I move to the agenda before us today, I'll have Brad Pacheco provide an update on December's committee direction regarding legislation on school employee enrollment.
Thank you, Charles. Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Brad Pacheco, CalPERS team. At the December Finance and Administration Committee, direction was given to the team to explore potential legislative solutions for an issue that can be faced by our classified school employees. And just as a reminder, as Mr. Fechter articulated, school employees that are not enrolled in the system due to the limited hours that they may work are often faced with a challenge if they want to purchase that time back later in their career, service prior to membership. And the challenge is that the employer may not always retain the proper records that are needed to validate that employment. And so one of the direction was given for us to explore a requirement for mandatory enrollment by school employees when they join a school system, regardless of the number of hours that they work. So we did some research. A couple of things to note. The law currently allows the County Office of Education to amend their contract to require mandatory enrollment today. To date, no County Office of Education has done so or amended their contract. We did meet with our stakeholder leaders, both the school employer leaders and the labor unions that represent classified school employees. The good news is they're very willing to work with us on this issue, both parties. They did express some initial concerns around mandatory enrollment. From an employer perspective, it does increase costs because you're enrolling a member in the system and an employer is starting to pay for that member from day one. both parties, both employers and labor, also expressed some concern around recruitment and retention of classified school employees at this level. Many of these employees are working limited hours, and while there's a value to be part of the defined benefit plan, they may not want to contribute to the plan out of their paycheck because it does reduce their wages. And so there was some concern about whether they could recruit the type of employees that they need. We have had conversations with Mr. Fechner about this. We want to explore some additional solutions. Given that the bill deadline for new bills is Friday, we want to take our time to make sure we get this right. And so we're going to be doing that over the course of the next few months and come back with some options. So unless there's any questions, that's the path forward that we're going to take.
All right, we do have some questions from the committee. Mr. Costigan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Pacheco, I'd assume since we're not going to have a bill by Friday, we're not going to introduce a spot bill. So therefore, we'll spend the remainder of the 2018 session just working on a resolution and have legislation in 2019.
That's correct. And we're also going to look at our own internal processes to see if there are ways that we can streamline it where we can accept other types of forms to validate the employment from the employer to make it easier on the member as well.
Thank you, Mr. Pacheco. Thank you, Ms. Taylor.
I have no further questions. Mr. Escalating?
Next, we'll move the action items for today. We will cover the review of the committee delegation. The second action item is the second reading of the amortization policy. The Actuarial Office is recommending 6 changes to the Actuarial amortization policy for public agencies, state schools, and the actuarial evaluations. The third action item seeks approval for the 2018 CalPERS Board of Administration State School and Public Agencies elections, notice of election. We have 3 information items today. Team members will present the proposed discount rate and supporting information for the CalPERS long-term program. You will hear a report on the 2017 CalPERS Board of Administration member-at-large election results, highlighting voter statistics for both the primary and the runoff elections. We'll conclude the meeting with the annual diversity report, highlighting initiatives, programs, and accomplishments from the last fiscal year. The next Finance and Administration Committee is scheduled here in Sacramento for April 17, 2018, and would include the first reading of the 2018-19 annual budget, annual review of board member employer reimbursements, and request to transfer assets and liabilities to San Bernardino County Employees Retirement Association, and an extension on the EMC IT contract. Madam Chair, that concludes my report, and I'll be pleased to take any questions at this time.
All right. Seeing no questions, let's move on to item 4, our action consent items. Can I get, thank you. I got a motion to move it from Mr. Jones.
Second.
I got a second from Mr. Gillahan. Is this a vote or all in?
No, all in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. That means we're moving on to consent items 5. I didn't have anything pulled off and no discussion. That's our calendar review. So we are moving to item 6, delegation review.
I'm going to go. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee and the board. Marlene Timberlake-Diadamo, CalPERS team member. This agenda item 6 comes to you as part of the annual review process for the committee's delegation. At this time, we are not recommending any changes to the proposed delegation, which was approved last year in 2017. At this point, I'll take any questions if there are any.
I'll move item 6A.
Are there any there are no questions on item 6A. This is an action item.
I'll move 6A.
Well, and I have a motion. I have a second. I have a motion by Mr. Costigan, a second by Mr. Jones. All those in favor of adopting 6A?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Okay, seeing none, the item passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
That means we're moving on to the actuarial reporting. And I guess that's Scott Terrandondo and Randy. Randy, I'm not saying your last name. I was waiting.
Randy Zubek.
Zubek, okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee, Scott Trando, Chief Actuary. Back in November, our office presented a initial reading of the amortization policy. We had suggested a number of changes to the policy, and we ran through some of the reasons behind those choices. Based on feedback that we got from the board, a number of employers, employer organizations, as well as labor organizations, we went back, we reviewed the comments that were made, we looked at some of the options that we had available, and we also held a webinar where we sat back, we solicited feedback from employers, as well as provided additional explanations behind the policy. With that, we're back today to go over our recommendations for our suggested changes. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Randy Zubak, who will kind of step through our choices, our recommendations, and kind of some background on why we made the choices we did.
Thanks, Scott. Good afternoon. Randy Zubek, CalPERS Actuarial Team. As Scott said, we're going to talk about our proposed amortization policy. Now, this is an action item, and we have prepared this with all of our proposed changes to the policy. However, as you'll see in both the agenda item and in the slides we'll talk about today, we have opened up the discussion to include some variations of our proposed changes, just for completeness and for consideration by the board and the committee. Whenever you design an amortization policy, there are a number of factors and goals that you take into account, and 3 of them are on this particular slide. These are 3 very important goals that we looked at in coming up with this proposed policy: benefit security, intergenerational equity, and contribution payment stability. I think the first and the third are pretty straightforward. Intergenerational equity is simply the concept of paying for the benefits of the members in the plan during their period of active service. And the reason that that's important is if we don't do that, if the cost for those benefits extends beyond that period of time, well, now we have new active members that have taken their place, and we're basically shifting the cost of the benefits from one generation to another. So why are we coming to you and recommending some changes? I think with regard to the first 2 goals, this is where we believe that we can attain some improvement with a couple changes. So benefit security and intergenerational equity. And we'll discuss that in more detail as we get into the presentation. With regard to the third item, contribution stability, we recognize that as we attempt to make improvements in these first 2 areas, that can sometimes introduce additional contribution volatility. So this is a balancing act. We've got a lot of objectives, and it's nearly impossible to satisfy all of them to the fullest extent we would like. So we do our best to balance the different objectives. And also, we think it's important to recognize the industry standards that exist. There are no hard and fast rules that this kind of UAL has to be amortized this way or that way. There's a lot of guidance out in the industry, mostly prepared by actuarial bodies who have obviously a lot of experience in this area. And we won't go into all of their recommendations and discussion, but we will say that in a couple areas, the current CalPERS policy is outside of their recommendations. So this is what our current amortization policy looks like. Our unfunded liability for each of our plans is made up of various layers. A layer is created anytime something happens unexpectedly, an actuarial gain or loss, a change in our assumptions, a benefit provision change. So every year through our valuation process, the actuaries measure the impact of those changes, and we establish a line item in our amortization schedule. And each of those items has its own specific payment schedule. The period over which we amortize those changes is shown on this slide. So, for example, gains and losses are currently amortized over 30 years. Assumption change is 20 years, and benefit change is 20 years. Golden handshake is just a specific type of benefit change, and those are amortized over 5 years. Now, in addition to the period, another important factor of the policy is the pattern of the year-by-year contributions. In a more simple example, very comparable to a mortgage on a house, you may set up a level payment schedule. We call that level dollar amortization. So if the payment in year one is $1,000, it's $1,000 in every year throughout the payment period. Now, CalPERS uses an increasing schedule, which a lot of other systems around the country also use. And that is, the schedule is set so that the first year payment is lower than it otherwise would be, and it increases by a fixed percentage amount every year throughout the payment period. So it starts lower, ends higher, pays off the same amount as it would for a level dollar approach. It's just a different pattern of payments. Then thirdly on the slide, we have a feature of our amortization policy that we call our ramp. And basically what that does is it phases in the impact of these new UAL payments over a 5-year period. So when a new base is created, rather than charge the employers the full first-year annual payment, we charge 20% in some cases. And then in the second year, 40%, 60, 80. It takes 5 years to fully phase into that full annual payment. So we have that 5-year ramp up on several of the bases, not all, and also a 5-year ramp down in the last 5 years of the period. So from a high level, what are we recommending we change? Well, going back to our periods, we saw that gains and losses are amortized over 30 years, and we have become less comfortable with that 30-year period. We would like to suggest a shorter than 30-year period for gains and losses. We are also recommending that we switch from a level percent of pay or increasing payment pattern to a level dollar pattern. With regard to the ramps, we are proposing that we eliminate all of the ramps on the back end of the period, so all of the down ramps. And we're also proposing that we eliminate the ramps on the front end for everything except investment gains and losses. And we'll talk about why that is later in the slides. Now, a very important point is that these proposed changes will affect only new UAL changes, whether positive or negative. So any bases that currently exist in a plan's amortization schedule would continue to be amortized under the current policy. Now, these next couple slides, slides 6 and 7, I'm going to just give kind of a high-level overview of these. I want to get to slide 9, which has the meat of the presentation. So these slides go through point by point the effects of, first of all, a shorter amortization period, and then secondly, switching from level percent to a level dollar pattern. And I think just generally, you can go through these points. Some of them are fairly self-explanatory, but in general, with regard to our objectives, a shorter period and level dollar amortization, we believe will result in an improvement with respect to the goals of benefit security and intergenerational equity, but on the flip side, will possibly introduce a little bit more contribution volatility. And the only other point I'll make on these is level dollar amortization does eliminate negative amortization, which is something that we've talked about in previous discussions. Negative amortization simply means a payment in any year is not as great as the interest on the outstanding balance. And when that happens, by the end of the year, the outstanding balance has actually gone up rather than gone down. We call that negative amortization. And that tends to happen with level percent of pay patterns with longer periods. If switching to level dollar amortization gets rid of negative amortization, even with longer periods. And as we said, with regard to the ramps, the only ramp we are proposing to keep is the 5-year ramp up on investment gains and losses. And the reason for that is just we think we'll need that to control contribution volatility at a reasonable level. Other systems around the country primarily use some type of asset smoothing, which accomplishes the same goal. We made the decision several years ago to move away from asset smoothing and simply use market value in our valuations. And so without this 5-year ramp, we could see substantial contribution volatility. Okay, slide 9. There's a lot going on here, obviously, but we like the fact that we got everything on one page and you can see it all together. So what this is our team's evaluation of the various options in front of us, the current policy, along with some of the alternatives that we're talking about. And a color grading system where green generally means we're comfortable. That's generally good. Red meaning we're not comfortable. Yellow, somewhere in the middle, could mean it's not something where we have to take that option off the table, but it perhaps isn't ideal, and there are some concerns. And if you see NAs in a box, that generally means that, for example, with regard to the period, there really is no difference between a 15, 20, 25, or 30-year period with regard to simplicity and transparency. So there's just no color evaluation. So as we look at this chart, we look at each feature of the policy one at a time. First with the period, and we're showing you our evaluation for 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, and 30 years. And what you can see is that with regard to benefit security and intergenerational equity, we prefer the 15 or 20-year period. 25 years starts to get to the outside of our comfort level, and 30 years we no longer recommend. And we have pretty much the opposite situation with regard to contribution volatility. The longer the period, the less volatile we are. So we're green for the longer periods, and we start to get into the yellow for the shorter periods. The other couple items that we've added here, short-term budget concerns and simplicity, transparency. Obviously, we've had a lot of stakeholder outreach. We've talked to our folks around the state and have heard their concerns. And we wanted to be cautious of implementing a change that would have a short-term impact that would be very problematic to our agencies. And as far as simplicity, transparency, we think that is probably under-talked about in some of the actuarial publications, but we think it's certainly an important part of from a governance standpoint, to be as simple and as transparent as we can be. So let's move on to the payment pattern, which is either level dollar or level percent. And you can see both of those have some greens and yellows. There really isn't much of a difference in our evaluation. We lean towards level dollar because it's a little better for benefit security and intergenerational equity, also much more simple and transparent. When we establish a base and show the first year contribution for that base, that's the payment for the next 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is. Whereas now, when we show the first year payment 20 years out or 30 years out, it's a much higher payment that you don't see in the valuation report. Now, the third item is when we would actually implement these changes. When we came to you last year in December, the thinking was that we would implement the changes perhaps in 2017. And just given where we are on the calendar and where we are regarding our progress on those reports, that would be problematic to try to implement those changes in those reports. We estimate it would probably delay the release of those reports by about 8 weeks, and that's the reason for the red box under simplicity. With regard to budget concerns, what we found in our analysis is that if we implement these changes earlier, either 2017 or 2018, one or both of the remaining interest rate changes that are still to come in the valuations would be covered under the new policy. And under the new policy would lose the 5-year ramp. And so what we tended to see when we modeled this was a fairly material increase in the next 1 or 2 years of projected contributions for our agencies. And that's the primary reason we're leaning towards implementation in 2019. It gets the final discount rate change in place under the old policy, where our agencies have seen projections of the impact of those changes already, and we thought it would be easier on them to not have to see new numbers, quite frankly. So we are recommending implementation in 2019. Okay. we wanted to show you some impacts of projected contributions due to these policy changes. Now, we're starting out with just a base projection here. This is a sample agency, public agency, typical plan, about 68% funded. The dashed black line is the projection that we prepared in the 2016 valuation reports. Now, one thing that we didn't know that we've learned since is that we had an 11.2% return for the following year, ending June 30, 2017. So the green line here just reflects that 11.2% return. So it brought the projected contributions down from what agencies have seen in their 2016 reports. Now, the green line is the current amortization policy, but actually in this situation, it's all of the amortization policies that we're looking at, for the simple fact that the assumptions here are that everything plays out in the future exactly as we would expect, which isn't likely, but it's always a good place to start. So because the amortization policy changes are for new bases only, there's no impact in this chart because there would be no new bases. And so, in order to see the impact of the amortization policy changes, we have to introduce something that we wouldn't expect, which leads me to the next slide. So here we've constructed an investment return scenario of a 3% return for the next 3 years, and then going back to our expected 7%. And this is just a made-up scenario to show how the different policies would project future contributions. And what you can see immediately is that even under our current policy, which is the green line, contributions are going to have to go up because investments didn't earn the 7% we expected. So I think what's important to look at here is the difference between the blue line and the green line, the blue line being our recommended policy versus the green line, which is our current. And if you go along over this period, you can see a difference of maybe 1 to 2% increase in the projected contribution by shortening the period and moving to the level dollar amortization. And then, of course, on the flip side, if we have positive returns, and we've assumed here 11% for 3 years, all the contribution projections go down. But interestingly, all of the shorter periods come up with lower projected contributions than the current period because we're recognizing those gains faster under our shorter periods. And then we just have a summary of those last couple charts all on one chart together, just so you can kind of visually see the kind of differences these policy changes make. Now, this is just a couple scenarios. There are lots of things that can happen. We're showing only a 1 or 2% change between the policies, but of course, if the market dropped like it did in 2008, which was about a minus 25%, well, then the difference would be a little bit bigger. But for simplicity, these are the three that we modeled, and we think this gives a pretty good indication of the impacts. Okay, sort of a unrelated, but also important policy change that we're recommending is that for an inactive plan, we cap the amortization period at 15 years. Now, these are plans where there are no active members in the plan, and under our intergenerational equity goal, these plans should be fully funded. There are no active employees, and so if there's an unfunded liability, we have already kind of forced that onto the next generation, and having those periods go out to 30 years, we thought that was not appropriate, and in fact, for these plans, we'd like that period to not exceed 15 years. Okay, so the next two slides, just one at a time, go through our recommendations. We are recommending we change the 30-year period to 20 years for gains and losses. We are recommending all future bases will be on a level dollar payment basis. We are recommending that the ramp is removed for all bases in all cases except for the first 5 years for investment gains and losses. We are recommending that the changes I just mentioned are effective on the June 30, 2019 valuation. And finally, we're recommending a 15-year maximum period for inactive plans, with that beginning with this current valuation. There's not really no reason to delay on this particular recommendation. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions.
So thank you very much. And I myself, before I go forward, have a couple of questions for you. The ramp up, ramp down that you're recommending be removed, and I know you said why. I would like you to kind of make that a little clearer for me. So we currently have a program in place that we after our 7%, then we go ahead and move forward with our, I think it was 20-year smoothing process, correct? That's not what you're talking about?
Well, there's a lot of factors in that question, but the current policy, I'll start with that, has a 5-year ramp for several of the different types of bases, assumption changes and gains and losses. And what that ramp does is it just phases in the payment, the cost of the payment over a 5-year period. So it's designed to limit volatility. The first year payment comes in relatively small and it gradually notches up until you get to the full payment. So now the board did move to reduce the discount rate from 7.5 to 7 in 3 different steps. We have already reflected the first step down to 7.375 in the 2016 valuations, and we're going to recognize the 7.25 in 2017. Now, if they stay under the current policy, each of those layers, as we recognize each of those discount rate changes, it will create a layer that will have a payment schedule. It will be paid over 20 years, but each of them will have the 5-year ramp. Under the current policy, we are recommending that we remove that ramp going forward, but we're recommending that we get past the implementation of the discount rate changes just because that was adopted a year ago. Agencies have seen projections on the impact of those changes under the current policy already and likely have included that in their budgets.
So you want to remove the ramp that reduces volatility?
We want to keep the ramp for investment gains and losses because those are the most significant of the UAL changes. And quite honestly, without having some type of asset smoothing, we think we really do need that 5-year ramp for that reason. For any other reason, we would like to remove that ramp. It appears to us to be over smoothing. It's creating negative amortization. Typically, those bases are not going to be as big as the investment gain loss basis.
So with the 20-year amortization, you don't want to have this ramp take place, even though it reduces volatility for the employers.
We want to keep it only for investment gains and losses going forward.
So, and that 5-year ramp would actually make it a 25 years is basically what that would work out to be?
No, it's still 20 years. So for the first 5 years, it's ramping up. And then in year 5, it's the full annual payment. And then it's level for 15 years. So still a 20-year period. Ramps up for 5. Now, because it's starting out lower than it really should be starting, by the time it gets to the 5th year, it has to be higher than if we just had a level payment. So it's just pushing contributions from the earlier years to the later years.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I have a couple questions, and I'll try to make them somewhat coherent. But first off, when I look at your attachment 1, and I think about these kind of decision factors, the goals, the benefit security, intergenerational equity, long-term, short-term, simplicity, industry guidelines. It kind of looks like this weights them all more or less equally. They're kind of go, no go. And I think realistically, they're not equally important to us, and certainly not to our different employer and member segments. And I would suggest if, something like whether something is in line with professional and industry guidelines may be much more important internally to you all than it would to us, and may have little or no relevance. We're a unique organization to our members and others. And so I really have concerns about the volatility and how we weight that, given that volatility up down. Two totally different things in terms of consequence and probability that cause that to be the downside potential for some of our folks, especially municipalities, for instance, who are teetering. The consequence of this decision is much more dire than it would be, say, perhaps for state miscellaneous. So I'm new here, so I can kind of fall back on that a little bit, but I'm not sure I'm that comfortable that we kind of look like we're weighting these things equally, and we're not really talking about the real world consequence of these over the relatively short term of 4 or 5 years. And is there some more consideration that should be given to deploying or implementing over more of a staged deployment, or instead of 2019, 2020, 22, 24, I don't know. So I just toss that out there.
Yeah, those are great comments. I'm just going to go back to the projections really quick. I just want to just make sure that this is clear. For example, here in this bad investment scenario, if you will, 3% for 3 years, you can see the contributions really are the same under any of the policies until 2021-22. And that's because of the 2-year lag between our valuation date and when the contributions are due. So if we implement this in 2019, the first time it could actually change someone's contribution would be in 21-22. So just wanted to make sure that's clear. I completely agree with your assessment that different agencies are going to place a different level of importance on those different objectives. I would say from our standpoint, we may have preferred a 15-year to 20-year period with regard to satisfying our benefit security and intergenerational equity goals, but realized that might have pushed the contribution volatility to an unmanageable point for some of our agencies. So it is a compromise, but just because we like this doesn't mean everybody will. We certainly understand that.
And to just add one comment, by keeping the first year's payments lower, what that does is it just creates the negative amortization situation, which means your payments in 3 to 4 years are going to be higher than what they would have done. Think about your credit card payment. If you make your minimum payment on a credit card, your balance keeps on going up and up. Your minimum payment keeps on going up and up. So by continuing to pay this really small payment, you're just putting yourself in a bigger hole down the road. It's more convenient now today because I can afford the minimum payment, but all you're doing is you're having your unfunded grow, and you're going to find yourself in a situation where, kind of where we are today, where the unfunded has grown to a point where the minimum has now become a problem. And so what happens is it builds upon itself. And another kind of point going forward here is right now, since this is prospective for 2019, we don't know if it's going to be a gain or loss. We expect, obviously gains and losses to offset one another. And to the extent that does happen, they will, you'll have the gain and the loss offsetting one another. So we would anticipate that you wouldn't see those big changes. And to Randy's point, also, for the investment gain losses, which are the biggest portion that we see, we are still having that 5-year ramp up and down. So even we recognize the big volatility, and we're still having a 5-year ramp up. So when you think about it, you're taking a gain or loss over 20 years. You have a loss over 20 years, and then you're going to amortize over 20 years. So you're taking 1/20th of the loss, and then we're going to turn around and take 1/5 of that. So it's 1/100th of the loss that's occurred. That's how small of payment we're talking about right now. And that's also kind of why when you have sustained losses, we get in a situation where rates continue to increase over the next 5 to 6 years, and you have this growing unfunded. So those are some of the complexities that we've had to kind of deal with and try and come up with what we feel is the best solution from our side.
David, you done?
Yep, thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Paquin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wanted to thank you both and the actuary team for all the additional information you brought forward on this item. It's been very helpful. And I think, from the controller's point of view, the negative amortization is a problem. And it's a matter of weighing that against the employer's ability to pay. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the implementation plan and recognize that you're being sensitive to some of the feedback that you heard about wanting to implement and letting the other discount rate changes go forward. But if there are local employers that want to implement sooner in order to take advantage of last year's 11.2% return, would that be possible even if their reports were going to be a few weeks late?
Yeah, so the 11.2% was for the year ending June 30, 2017. So to reflect that under the new policy, we would have to reflect that in the current valuations, which I think you've correctly stated. There's not any reason that we are opposed to any earlier implementation than 2019. As we've stated and as you've restated, it would delay the 17 valuations. Now, if somebody wanted to implement in 18 instead of 19, again, we don't have any philosophical opposition to that. And we would have plenty of time to work that into our calculation process. So those are options that would be viable.
And on a mechanical process, would the employer then have to contact you to say we wanted to start this earlier, and you would work directly with them?
Well, understand it's not part of the policy that we are proposing today. It doesn't mean that the board has the final decision on all of this. And so I think together we could come up with whatever we want the policy to be.
And then on the flip side, I understand the policy still retains the ability, if the board decides to shorten the amortization period to 20 years, for example, a distressed employer would still have the opportunity to work with your staff to request that their particular amortization period be extended to 30 years?
There continue to be hardship rules within the policy. There are criteria that an agency has to meet for them to be accepted and allow them to extend their amortization period, but those provisions are still in place.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Gillahan, I want to make it clear for our new folks. I always call on our committee members first, and then I will call on others. Mr. Gillahan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are we still phasing in some of the losses from 0809? Didn't we have a unique corridor, and then anything that was outside of that corridor got packaged separately and stacked on top?
Yeah, though, I'm going to have Scott address that since I wasn't here when that happened.
Yeah.
Before you do, Scott, maybe I could ask a question differently. On slide 10,
Yeah.
where we show just the effects, is the one slide back.
Oh, sorry.
So that curve that keeps going up until 2024, what's driving that increase besides the discount rate change? Or is that only the discount rate change?
Discount rate changes and the last 2 years prior to the 16 valuation were returns less than 7%. I think it was 0.6 and 2.4% in those 2 years. So those are being paid off, and they're also on the 5-year ramps. So that's what's leading to those increases over that period.
And I just want to reiterate the point that under your proposal, the employers would also see the benefit of exceptional investment performance years to the good. They'll see those sooner than they would under the current model. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
So it works to the good and the bad.
Yeah, so this slide illustrates that, where all of these shorter periods result in lower contributions than the current policy, which is the green line. Now, as Scott said, we expect a mix of gains and losses.
Sure.
Yeah.
This job would be a lot easier if we could always expect, the upside. So where are we with our current policies relative to peer pension systems in North America? Are we an outlier? Are we on sort of the questionable edge of reasonability of our policies?
Well, we have some information on other California systems that are not part of CalPERS. I'm not sure which attachment that was in. Actually, it's in the appendix. So with regard to other systems within California, many of them have a substantially shorter period. So yeah, we have these here on page 6, page 7. So yeah, we definitely, with our 30 years, are outside of most of these. Now, when we talk about state systems in other states, I think they're all over the map. I did see the presentation that was given to the board by Keith Brainerd from NASRA. He did have a slide on trends in amortization period, and I want to say his chart basically showed a declining period over the last several years, and at something at around 26 on average now around the country. Scott, do you have any other information on that? So let's say the average is 26 for other state systems, but clearly, if you look at the trend on a declining path, and I'm sure other systems continue to look at this as we are, and I would expect it to continue to shorten.
And just one last question, if I could, Madam Chair. What is, from a sort of actuarial standards and professional standards, what's driving this trend to be sort of more aggressive and how quickly we amortize liabilities?
Well, the guidance is in several different places. For example, the Conference of Consulting Actuaries has a white paper on guidance for funding a public pension plan. The Government Finance Officers Association has a similar paper, as does the California Advisory Panel. And all of them are pointing to periods shorter than 30 years. Again, there is no absolute requirement that we do this, but all of the current thinking, all of the guidance that does exist is suggesting that 30 years is longer than it should be.
But my question is, what's the underlying rationale for this direction?
Well, I think the first two items, our first two goals, just benefit security and intergenerational equity. I think probably intergenerational equity is driving those shorter periods, again, because the average future working lifetime of active members is closer to 15 than 30. And so at 30 years, most believe that you are pushing costs of those members to another generation. Now, with regard to benefit security, we're at 70% or so funded, and it changes pretty drastically every day the last couple weeks. And so from a benefit security standpoint, if we have another market downturn, let's say, we would like a policy that helps us recover faster than the 30-year policy.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick question. How long has the 30-year been in effect? The 30-year amortization? Do we know?
It's been in effect for a long time. Back in the, I would say, the 90s, we had what we call an open amortization period, an open 30, where basically each year we would take the unfunded liability and amortize it over 30 years.
But we weren't unfunded, and were we? Oh, we were fully funded.
Right. There were some plans that were overfunded and some that were superfunded. But for any plans that had an unfunded liability, we would take the unfunded liability and amortize it over 30 years on an open basis, which meant that the following year, we would just take the unfunded and amortize it over 30 years again. And we just kept this process going. So in effect, you would never pay off your unfunded. I think.
Yeah, but that was an outlier is what you're saying.
Well, actually, that was kind of like generally standard practice 20, 30 years ago. And I think the industry has modified its view and matured its views in terms of bringing that amortization period down, closing it, instead of open amortization. What we have is we call closed layers, where the amortization period goes from 30 to 29, 28, 27. Where you think about a car loan or a mortgage, where it goes on every year. It's just been the general recognition, I think, in the industry that the assumption of it's going to, cities and governments are going to be going forever and exist forever. I think we've had some bankruptcies, and there's some recognition that it's it may not happen. The benefit security is an issue, and you also have the intergenerational equity. I think is a real concern.
Well, I will say as intergenerational equity, what you're saying is those of us that have been paying for 30 years forever now, before we retire, are going to have to pay, I don't know that it'll transfer to us, but the employers are going to have to pay a ton. It's not really intergenerational. It goes to the employers, correct?
To some extent. I mean, we do have employers that have cost sharing, where
For PEPRA?
No. We have actually employers
Okay,
that
how many
cost
is
share
that?
the unfunded liability with the employees.
How many is that? Is it a lot?
Not too many.
All right.
But there is some
So it's pretty
concern.
minimal, is what you're saying. Compared to, for 1.8 million, is that a lot?
No, it's a small number.
Okay, so that intergenerational equity is not necessarily something that needs to be a concern.
From a taxpayer's point of view, I would say yes.
That's not intergenerational equity, though.
Well-
You're asking for taxpayer equity. That's a difference. But I'm going to go on to Mr. Costigan here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Toronto, I just want to compliment you and your staff. Over the last couple of years, you all have had to tackle some very difficult issues. I think yesterday, Sacramento Bee acknowledged the efforts that we had done as it related to the discount rate by the fact that both our chief investment officer and others have acknowledged that we have gone our positive cash flow. I think when you look at the amortization policy, you approach it as a three-legged stool. What we've done over the last couple of years is address the discount rate. We've addressed the asset allocation, and this is really the third component of it. I'm going to make it clear here, I'm going to support the 20-year. I will respectfully disagree with Mr. Miller as it relates to the fact that the organizations that are recommending a reduction and that the industry standard are 15 years are not simply just organizations that we shouldn't pay attention to. The California Actuarial Advisory Panel, the Conference on Consulting Actuaries, the Government Finance Officers Association, and the Society of Actuaries Blue Ribbon Panel all recommend a period of 15 to 20 years. At 30 years, we're the outlier. We're not the trendsetter, is that correct? We're not even an industry standard at 30 years.
That's correct.
Okay, and if we were to reduce to 15 years, that is would put us in the middle of where the other organizations and other pensions funds are.
Yes, that is correct. You can see by just on the slide up there right now, half of them are 15, half of them are 20.
And I understand, and I would certainly hope, Madam Chair, at some point we'll ask Ms. Dunning, the board's independent fiduciary counsel, to take what is our consideration to take into how we are to consider the impact on local employers. But as I understand it, with over 3,000 employers, we heard from a handful of employers that may have concerns with it, and I believe we were
10%.
just 10%. And of that 10%, there were a portion that supported and a portion that don't like it, and I believe the city of South San Francisco just handed us something. But in the scenarios that you ran an optimistic and a pessimistic. You ran a 3% and you ran 11%. Yesterday at Investment Committee, again, it was reiterated, I believe our consultants and our staff are projecting a 6.1 over the next 10 years. So I'm curious as to why we didn't run a 6.1 return. And if we did, I assume it's just between the 3 and the 11 on the way the chart would look? I'm just,
It looks like
why
I got
did
a
we run
nod
at
over there.
3%? Why did we run at 3%, which is extremely pessimistic? I'm just trying to get at, yesterday, what we've talked about for the last couple of months is our internal folks and our outside folks are talking a little over 6, right? And the volatility of the market yesterday, not rehashing it. The 3% is extremely pessimistic. Certainly hope we don't have a 0.62 again. I also think the return we reported this last week, again, was through the end of the year, not taking into consideration what's happened in the last 2 weeks. So where would, if we had run a 6.1, where would we be?
So first of all, to answer one of your questions, the 3% and the 11, those are the 25th and 75th percentile of where we expect returns to be. So we believe most often our returns are going to be within that range. If we had run a 6.1% model, you would have seen those lines almost on top of each other, the 30-year versus 20-year. And if we just go back to the 3%, by the way, there are some schools projections in the appendix if anybody's interested in those. In the main body of the presentation, these are again a public agency. And so this is a 3% for 3 years, and you can see the maximum differential between the blue and the green is maybe 2%. And it actually gets smaller as you go further. We didn't go beyond 2032 because we assume nobody cares what happens beyond 2032, but actually they cross over at some point.
Into a positive.
Yeah, with you would be paid off in 20 years under the blue line, and the blue line will drop below the green line.
And just a couple other points. This is 2019, so it would still give the committee and the board the opportunity if there was significant concerns raised by local governments. The implementation is 18 months from now. The other is from a planning purpose, continuing to push this item out really we're driven by the June 30th deadlines for you to get the amortization reports out. Is that correct?
Yes, for the 2017 reports, we've already been working on those. It would be difficult for us to change the policy at this point.
And just one last point. I would like to ask our chief actuary, as our chief actuary, in your opinion, as the CalPERS chief actuary, is the adoption of a 20-year a prudent decision? Adopting a 20-year plan, is that a prudent decision?
Yes, it's a prudent decision.
And is maintaining the 30 years a prudent decision?
No.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, I still have a couple of committee members that haven't spoken, so hold on just a second. Henry Jones?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My whole laser sharp goal is sustainability of the fund. And I look at the amortization as just one component. We have all these other factors that are moving all the time. So, as you mentioned, the people working fewer years. We also got the ratio of active to retirees closing the gap where several years ago it was 2 to 1, and now it's probably 1.3 to 1 in terms of, so all these factors could have a serious negative effect on our funded status going forward. So with that regard, I'm interested in taking steps to make sure the fund is sustainable over the long term. And this is one piece of that puzzle, to look at this amortization to help maintain the fund over a longer period of time. The other question I have is that while we may be comparing what the period of time for amortizations are for these various agencies, but do they have the exact kind of plan we have? I know out of state, they're hybrid types of plans, so that's a factor that could change the interpretation of the data. So are all the funds in the state of California are purely defined benefit plans, whether or not there are any hybrid plans that would have an effect on how they calculate their amortization policy?
I think in general, they're similar enough to us where it's a good apples-to-apples comparison. I'm not aware of any that are so different that would require a drastically different amortization policy, but it's possible. That is possible. Scott, do you know of any?
No, I think most of the plans that we were up there in the comparison were defined benefit plans.
Okay. And then just a side question, the golden handshake, that has minimal impact on the long-term funding ability of the funding status of the fund, right? Because it's covered in a short period of time. So my question is, do we approve that for the agencies, or are we just reviewing and opining on it?
We don't approve it. We simply are notified that somebody has provided this, and we create an amortization base for it.
Okay.
If you're looking for answers about how that process works, we might have to ask someone from the audience to step up.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to know whether or not we were in approval of that process as opposed to providing data.
No. Right now, when a golden handshake, the employer requests information on it, and they decide whether they want to offer it to their employees or not.
Okay.
So it's an employer-based decision.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Ms. Hollinger?
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. I just wanted to speak to the importance of our chief actuaries and the actuarial work. over 75% of our plans have negative amortization. And chief actuaries in the insurance industry, they make or break a carrier because they provide independent advice to boards and senior management on key financial risks facing an insurer. They're considered the guardians of the financial strength and equity in the insurance industry. The chief actuary must drive change and precipitate a business strategy as our risks change and evolve. It's not a one-off change, but it's an ongoing continuum as we have to adapt to different risks as time change. And life has changed in the past 20 years. We're a maturing population, which translates into greater assets, greater liabilities, greater volatility, and improved life expectancy. I've actually been there when insurance contracts have lapsed because the hurdle rate on that catch-up premium is so high that it's no longer viable. And one of my concerns is I'm very worried about the same thing happening on the pension side in reference to the unfunded liability. I'm worrying that pushing off these payments will lead to the same outcome that I've witnessed in the insurance industry. And our chief actuary has recommended, I don't know, I even saw things from different actuaries of 15 years. I believe 20 years is the compromise. And that I support our recommendation, and I think by rejecting it, we would be severely jeopardizing not only the long-term viability of the fund, the sustainability of the fund, as well as being a fiduciary to all members of the fund, including, as you say, intergenerational equity. So, Scott, and I know it's not an easy message to deliver, but it's a necessary message. And so I really value and appreciate it, and I support the 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Brown?
Thank you. I'd like to start out by saying I support the 20-year amortization as well. What I didn't know about was the hardship rules. I sort of read through the item, but I didn't know if it was in here or not. But it's nice to know that we have those available for our employers that do get into some serious trouble. Again, benefit security is my #1 priority, and elimination of the negative amortization is good fiscal policy. And most importantly, by making this change, we can't be accused of accounting gimmicks and hiding our obligations. And I just want to say thank you again for all your work and effort in this regard.
Thank you, Mr. Slayton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a particular issue that strikes home to me since in the seat I hold, I represent the local government employers who have the most difficulty with this. We have one PERF, and the state of California is very different than local agencies when it comes to this particular issue. I do believe that the intergenerational issue is a big problem. And having that amortization period over 30 years does create a situation where we are passing along the impact of this, of the current plan to future employees. And I think it's incumbent upon us to bear that cost within the working span of the people who are receiving the benefits and who are in the plan today. So that's #1. #2, I think I would encourage the committee to focus on this issue of this change reducing the chance of going below a 50% funded status. We're at, what are we at, 70 right now, 67?
We're somewhere between 68 and 70. It really depends on how the market's doing today.
That is not a great position to be in. And all it takes is another movement or two, and we could find ourselves in a position where we cannot recover. So I think that's of critical import when we have the opportunity to make changes that are going to be challenging for employers, but not going to be something that they cannot deal with, particularly if we've got a process for organizations that are under stress. One of the questions I have for you right now is that stress issue. Is that something that's defined that we're in charge of? Do we seek a third party? Does the controller's office determine that? How do we determine that an agency, a local government agency, cannot afford to be on a 20-year amortization?
Right now, right now, it's vaguely defined in CalPERS policy that CalPERS would look at the.
Right. I had a hunch that was the case.
Would look at where the employer is. It would be, I think, a bit easier if we had a third party, like the controller's office, making that determination, because we're not in the business of getting into an agency's financials and making a determination on what they can and cannot pay. That's not really our job.
Yeah, I had a hunch that was going to be the answer. I would refer the committee to the last paragraph, which I'll try to summarize pretty fast. This is from the letter from the finance director of Newport Beach that was in our package today, where he said, in my 30 years of local government experience, some of the worst decisions I've witnessed boards make have been to ignore the professional recommendations of their staff that are independent of politics and other external forces. It's incumbent upon us as fiduciaries to strongly consider the recommendation of staff that are doing the job that we hire them to do. So I would encourage the committee to do a couple of things: to accept the 20-year alternative, and to ask for development of a robust opt-out strategy so that it's clear what the process is for an agency that needs to stay at, say, 25 years. I'm not sure I would want them to stay at 30, maybe 20 and 25. 25 is maybe the opt-out version. But I would encourage the committee to support that and make that recommendation to the full board. Thank you.
So Scott, maybe we could, you made it sound like earlier we had a policy. It sounds like it's not really a policy. Can we have you put together a robust policy?
It is part of the policy now, but it's not clearly defined. So I think we should spend some time and get a more thorough process in place on that side.
Mr. Jacobs?
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Chair and board members. I think we must be looking at a different policy because I just looked at the policy and I think it's pretty clear. Okay. It's pretty laid out. Now, it does have a number of factors to be considered, but that's the only way you're going to be able to make this kind of determination. You can't have a...
Does it have to meet, does the municipality have to meet all of the factors, or is it just some of the is that
it's a multi-factor approach, a multi-factor evaluation.
Okay. And you think that's pretty well defined?
It's very well defined. It may be vague in the sense that there are various things that you need to consider, and none of them are going to necessarily be crystal clear because you're getting financials from the municipality, but I think it's well defined.
Okay. So maybe we could have that submitted to the committee next meeting. And now I'm back to people who have already spoken. Mr. Miller.
I think most of my questions have been answered. In particular, when it comes to Mr. Slayton's comments, what he said, I think that's really was where I was going for us to look at that and see, is it systematic? Is it accessible? Does it provide for reasonable thresholds for getting that relief and hardship? And if there's something we could, in future look at to make sure that it's current, it's up to date, it makes sense in the current environment, I think that really addresses my concerns. Thank you.
Mr. Gillihan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think on the advice of our Chief Actuary, I'd like to move the staff recommendation.
Second.
I appreciate that. I still have people who want to talk there. So we can come back to that, Mr. Gillahan? Thank you. Mr. Rubalcava? Oh, I'm sorry, let's try that again. Can you press your button again? Oh, you are? No, you're good.
Thank you. I'm fairly new, very new on this board, and I still remember last month I was on that side of the table testifying, and I would always on actuarial assumption changes, and my statement was usually always the same, whether it was Ventura or Santa Barbara or LA County, which was but I always advocate for a prudently funded benefit, but at the same time we would ask the board to also respect the other need was for a fiscally healthy employer. Now that I'm on this side of the table, I'm sure council is going to talk about the future responsibilities we have. And so I understand that, and I respect the direction we're going. But I also would ask that we take into consideration any mitigation efforts that can be prudently or reasonably implemented also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Paquin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to weigh in and say that, of course, the Controller's Office does monitor the fiscal health of cities and special districts, counties. So to the extent that we can be of help as you review some of these issues, please don't hesitate to call on our staff. Thank you.
All right. Oh, Mr. Jones?
Yeah, thank you. I have a friendly amendment.
Sure.
Okay, is that okay? Yeah, I still support the recommendation, but I would just have maybe it's a direction rather than a friendly amendment, to have staff bring back that policy so it can be reviewed and presented to the board.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, bring back.
The current policy actually is in the packet, so it's available for review.
Where?
But,
you want to tell us where?
Yes, so in the not the red line, but the final version of the policy on page 4 of 9.
And which attachment?
Attachment 3. And it would be item 10, request up to a 30-year extension due to severe financial hardship.
Page what? I'm sorry.
4 of 9.
4 of 9.
Oh, okay. I already had it. Is that on you? So, Madam,
yeah,
withdraw my friendly amendment request.
All right. So I don't have any further comments from the committee or our board members, but I do have requests to speak from the public. So before we vote, I'd like to hear from them. So I'm going to call you in groups of 3. Dorothy Johnson, Dylan Gibbons, Dane Hutchings, if you guys can line up here. And we're going to give you 3 minutes each. He's right there talking. Oops, sorry. Okay, Dorothy.
Good morning.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Dorothy Johnson with the California State Association of Counties. Want to, of course, start by expressing my sincere appreciation to the CalPERS team for not only an inclusive process with the asset liability management cycle earlier, but of course this most recent iteration on the amortization policy. You know, we were asked, the counties were asked, what's the right amount of time? And frankly, some of them came back to us and said, we're not the experts. The actuaries on CalPERS, these are the experts, and this is their recommendation, upholding fiduciary responsibility for fund management. and ultimately the goal of limiting negative amortization. So while many of our counties did not respond to the survey that was offered, they did side with the expert and professional recommendation of your staff. Now, some of the points were raised by the committee already, so I'll be brief, but we do appreciate the recognition of potentially an earlier start date. We would not want to go any later than 2019 because of the delay for actual implementation, but the opportunity, some counties did express a very strong desire to start early to take advantage of possible stronger market returns. In addition, when we're looking at volatility and risk, many of our employer agencies, our county said it's ultimately their responsibility, and it would be on their shoulders to create a safety net if there was unfortunate returns or unfortunate market conditions. And then finally, just want to briefly address not the specific financial hardship consideration here, but respectfully request that the board, should there be sort of a catastrophic event, and fingers crossed, of course, that's not the case, that the board would exercise their existing authority, like was done previously, to not just do a agency by agency reset, but potentially a whole system reset back to a 25 or 30-year period, again, only in that catastrophic scenario. So again, just really thankful for the opportunity to be engaged in this process for the many months leading up to this, and available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Gibbons.
Chair, members of the committee, Dylan Gibbons with the California Special Districts Association. I want to congratulate you on your chairmanship and thank Vice Chair Costigan for your leadership over the last year or so that I've been working with you in this position. With that, I also want to thank the CalPERS staff for their education and outreach to our membership and to our employers, letting them know, being there for questions, providing webinars, and serving as a resource to our membership. While the Special Districts Association isn't taking an official support position of the proposal, as we've done in the past, including on items such as the risk mitigation, we do support the board exercising their fiduciary responsibility and making the tough decisions to ensure the integrity of the fund. Based on the feedback that I've received from our membership, many of our members say that this will not be an issue for them. They were planning on paying their debts down sooner anyway, so that they could get the debt off of their books. And that while this is excellent for the health of the fund, probably won't have an impact on their financial stability. However, not all of our districts are created equal. Many of our districts are struggling currently. And when we include the reduced amortization period, coupled with the expected rate increases and what we're anticipating is a downturn in the market, these districts are going to struggle to figure out how to pay down their debts, meet their pension obligations, without reducing the services that they provide to the public. So for those districts, we would request, as Board Member Slayton brought up, an off-ramp, an option, a way to review and evaluate district by district whether or not 30 years or 20 years is the most appropriate amortization period for them. So with that, I think that we would be able to support the policy. However, following your actions today, I implore that this committee and the full board seek additional options or programs to assist the same employers that you're continually coming to ask for more money. Our members have expressed frustration that it seems that you keep coming to them asking for more, while at the same time not providing a lot of other options and assistance for them. They would be seeking a pre-funding trust fund where contributions are at the sole discretion of the employers. This would assist in addressing one of the questions that you had regarding volatility of their payments. With a pre-funding trust, they would be able to deal with the ups and the downs by having money that they submitted.
You're out of time.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hutchings?
Good afternoon, Chair and members. Dane Hutchings of the League of California Cities. Echo the comments made by my colleagues regarding flexibility and specifically also the 115 Trust. I think that would be a great tool in our tool belt. Locals can do that already. But of course, on the private side, there is a sort of a cost of doing business factor that profit margins that these guys have to include in their agreements, whereas for this body, that would not be the case. So we could actually save some money by doing a pre-funded trust here at CalPERS. But with regards to the matter at hand, given the wide range of fiscal solvency issues for my members, the League can't take a formal position on this. I've got, as you guys know, in September, I had several of our cities come up and express some significant challenges with the 20-year amortization schedule. Conversely, I have cities that have also reached out to me that have said that they would very much like to do the 20-year amortization schedule, and I believe there's a few cities today that may be testifying to that desire. With that being said, given the range of fiscal solvency of my cities, we can't take a formal position, but I am here today to offer perhaps some additional options for the board to consider. And given that we do have a year or so, 18 months to figure out implementation, we welcome the opportunity to work with this body to try to establish some of these criteria. One of the things that have been talked about today is the ability to opt out for hardship criteria. Now, I spent about an hour or so on the phone with your actuarial team trying to discern the difference between what the Fresh Start program is and what the hardship criteria is. And it looks like I may have got my wires crossed a bit, so I do apologize if there's aspects of my letter that seem a little bit inaccurate. But essentially what we're trying to avoid is that situation where you have a city that is already on the brink, and applying a 20-year amortization schedule would put them over the edge. I would like to see CalPERS fall in line with best practices established, recommended industry best practices. But I do believe there should be some consideration for opting out, and we would like to work with this body to try and establish some of those criteria, or perhaps modify those criteria. A second option that you may want to consider is I know that the 20-year is recommended. 25 years is still in the acceptable time range. So perhaps having a tiered system whereby if you have a highly distressed agency at 30, someone that can handle a 25-year, which would still be an acceptable range, and then a 20-year for agencies like the state and other well-funded local agencies. And finally, with regard to the ramp down elimination, we actually didn't get any feedback on that. We would generally support the ramp down. The ramp up, I think, it would pose a little bit of a challenge, but the ramp down is something that we would support because it would have a 25 years of more of a stable payment as opposed to a 20-year than a down ramp. So with that, thank you for your time.
All right, thank you. So I'm calling up Mr. Lee, Richard Lee, and Mike Futrell, South San Francisco. Oh, and I'm sorry, the Dan, I'm not going to say your last name correctly, Matsu, anyway. Newport. Yeah, from the city of Newport.
I know who you meant.
You know what I meant? Thank you. So, Mr. Lee, we're going to start with you.
If I may defer to our city manager first.
Sure, Mr. Futrell.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to briefly discuss the topic of CalPERS liability and its impact on the city of South San Francisco. My name is Mike Futrell, and I'm the city manager for the city of South San Francisco. The city of South San Francisco is focused on the future and how to piece together a sustainable contribution plan which maintains or improves our current level of service provided to our residents, visitors, and businesses, while contributing to a healthy retirement system. We understand that maintaining a healthy retirement system requires that cities, agencies, and public employees pay more into the system, given the past financial returns and future anticipated returns. But setting a plan in motion to contribute more towards CalPERS obligations takes time and no short amount of political skill. Elected officials, staff, labor groups, and the public must all come to appreciate the threat posed by an underfunded retirement system, and all develop the political will to make the hard choices necessary to keep cities solvent. In South San Francisco, we're pursuing a multi-pronged approach to meeting our PERS obligations, including asking our employees to pay a greater share into CalPERS, setting aside funds earmarked specifically for future PERS obligations, holding the line on expenses, increasing fees on our residents and businesses, and we will likely put a tax increase on the ballot this fall for our residents to consider. If all the pieces come together as hoped, the city of South San Francisco will weather the current CalPERS storm in time. But what it does take is time. Time to educate, negotiate, collaborate with stakeholders to gain a consensus on either raising revenue, cutting expenditures, or both. So today, what I'm asking for is time. Time to make our plans, to have our plans mature, to move to reality. And what that means specifically is a time period where this body holds off on any further rule changes, which will make it any more difficult for cities to meet their obligations and to stay afloat financially. While this body has been very proactive in reacting to market conditions and moving to ensure the solvency of CalPERS, which we applaud, recognize that cities are struggling to keep up. For example, in 2013, CalPERS implemented its current smoothing and amortization policy. In 2015, CalPERS adopted its risk mitigation strategy. In 2016, CalPERS implemented its discount rate reduction from 7.5 to 7%, and now in 2018, CalPERS is again considering a policy change to shorten the amortization period from 30 to 20 years, a change which will again move the goalpost and will make it more difficult for my city to meet its annual PERS contribution. Please do not misunderstand me. From the City of South San Francisco's perspective, we support this committee.
I'm sorry. Your time's up.
All right, thank you. I would introduce our Finance Director, Mr. Richard Lee from the City of South San Francisco.
Mr. Lee.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the Finance and Administration Committee. My name is Richard Lee, and I serve as Director of Finance for the City of South San Francisco. My brief comments this afternoon serve as an accompaniment to City Manager Futrell's comments. The two graphs before you demonstrate the impact of the discount rate reduction and proposed amortization policy changes to the City of South San Francisco's general fund over the next 10 years. The first graph before you reflects implementation of the discount rate reduction and projects that by 2027, the city will have an $8.6 million gap between its revenues and expenditures. As stated by Mr. Futrell, South San Francisco has implemented a broad array of solutions for future pension obligations, committing funds for future pension obligations, employee cost sharing, increasing fees, and pursuing a tax measure on the November 2018 ballot. Based on the estimated impact as depicted in Attachment 4 of CalPERS staff report, the proposed amortization policy over a 10-year period is not materially different for our agency. However, this projection illustrates the 2016-17 return on investment of 11.2% and assumes that CalPERS will earn the targeted discount rate thereafter. If actual investment earnings fall short, as you know, the amortized loss will be more severe over 20 years. That being said, in concept, the proposed policy change is in alignment with best practices. South San Francisco is fortunate to be able to absorb the additional pension costs that have accompanied CalPERS policy changes over the past 5 years. Our fear is that the next midterm ALM review will seek to further reduce CalPERS' risk profile, and as such, recommend further reduction of the discount rate. We ask that the committee consider the impact of this policy change in the context of future near-term ALM modifications. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. And Dan.
Dan Matuszewicz, Finance Director of the City of Newport Beach. Madam Chair and members of the board, what I laid out to you in my written submission basically is that I think the board, by having an extremely accommodative policy, amortization policy, is not unlike the Fed's overly accommodating monetary policy. In the long run, it really hurts folks. So keep in mind, we're talking about an operating liability. We're not financing a building that's going to last 60 years. So when we're talking about an operating liability, it almost sounds like by having a very loose amortization policy, you're looking to help agencies finance their operations over a long period of time. And that's just not good fiscal policy. So for those that are looking to help HERS meet their operating needs, I agree with my colleagues that they ought to look at other options first. You know, cutting the budgets in any way they can, maybe looking for tax-exempt financing of their capital projects, looking for tax-exempt financing on their short-term operating needs. But certainly, if I was looking for financing, I wouldn't be looking to CalPERS for a 7% loan. One, it's expensive. Two, CalPERS isn't a bank. It should be the bank of last resort. So while I applaud you for looking to accommodate the less fortunate, maybe those options should be sought in the private sector. Perhaps in the state controller's office, but I don't think it's the CalPERS board's primary objective is to be a banker to finance cities' operations. I think for those cities that want to get a jump on implementing this process sooner, there is the option of doing a fresh start shortly after the June 17 valves are completed, so they can pull those credits forward, and they can avoid the ramp if that's what they were looking to do. So I think this policy, I applaud Scott's efforts. I think it's the right thing to do, and I think it will help cities in the long run. And to the extent they need short-term solutions, they should be looking for those solutions elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can I have staff back up here? We have a motion, but I'm not ready. So we do have a motion on the floor, however, and a second. We had a couple of things brought up. I did want to answer to one of, I can't remember if it was Mr. Gibbons or Mr. Hutchings, basically talking about holding off for 20, I think you mentioned 25 years, so I did want to ask Mr. Taranto what that impact would be, doing a 25-year rather than a 20-year amortization. And it's yellow here, so it's not a bad thing, or it was, yeah, it's yellow here.
While 25 is what we looked at, we look at the whole range, it falls under the acceptable. We don't feel that the difference between a 25 is where we need to be. We had. Can
I ask you why?
We had internal discussions among the actuaries in our office on where we feel the most appropriate amortization periods should be, and we actually talked around the 15 to 20, and while 25 is better than 30, it's not where we want to be. We want to be at the 20.
Okay, I understand that, but I need a better reason than we want to.
All I can say is that that's our recommendation.
Okay.
We had a discussion. We feel it meets our needs. It meets the needs of the plan stability, and I think it addresses also it gets your funded status quicker. It beats it by 5 years versus 25.
Right.
And also the intergenerational equity. If you look at the liabilities, the duration of the liabilities are really below 15. So with 25-year amortization, you're 10 years
Could you
beyond.
explain? I don't understand that. Duration of liabilities?
Duration is, think about, when I say duration of liabilities, think about it as a weighted lifetime expectancy. So it's like a weighted expected lifetime or expected working lifetime. So when we look at liabilities, if say
okay. You said working lifetime, so that
it just you have your active members are working, and then you also have your retired lifetime.
Right.
So for retirees, you would be looking at their future whole lifetime. So it's kind of like a working lifetime for your actives, and then you have your duration for your retired lives as well. And if you look at both of those, they both fall under 15 years.
I thought the average working was 23 right now.
Yeah, but when you take in consideration, those are people who make it all the way to retirement. But if you look at how many people actually retire and quit, the expected working lifetime based on our assumptions is somewhere around under 10 years for working for actives.
Is that based on assumptions, or is that based on, because you can get that information?
Yeah.
So is that based on current information?
That's based on our assumptions. The expected lifetime is.
So it's not based on current information?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, so, because we can get that information.
I believe we could check with membership data service on that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not necessary,
the challenge
but you're
is we have a lot of people who, we have a lot of turnover in the early years where people are working 2 to 3 years and then leaving.
Right, but I think it still works out to an average. And I'm not looking at both schools and local and state, but I do know at state it's around 22, 23. So then if you work in schools, local public agencies, it probably goes down a little bit, but I don't think it's under 15. But I'm not, you don't have those figures, I don't have those figures, so we're not going to ask about that. But I was just trying to figure out why 25. So you're saying that our retirees look at a 15-year lifetime, our state employees are working for 15 years, that's why you were thinking 15 years, but 20 years seemed more reasonable.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, in terms of the impact on projected contributions, if you look at our charts, the lines of the 25-year versus the 20-year are fairly close together, and I've learned not to minimize those differences. It is more of an impact with 20 years, but those are fairly close in terms of what we expect the contributions to be under either 20 or 25.
Okay, so they're not too far away. If you do, yeah, here's the 25. Yeah, they're pretty close.
Yeah, so the orange and the blue lines on our charts.
Yeah. So on the 3% and then on the 11%. Yeah,
so given all the actuarial bodies are recommending 20 or less, we feel more comfortable with 20, given that 25 doesn't really provide an appreciable difference.
Even though it's an acceptable range according to your...
Well, we wouldn't want to say it's not acceptable.
Okay. And then I just... you guys had mentioned that earlier, that the 30 years that the public agencies, the cities, the counties that you have on our appendix here, that are between 15 and 20 years, do we have any other state retirement funds that are similar to our retirement funds, and what are theirs? Because I didn't see that.
We don't have anything in the material. I mentioned in one of my earlier comments that I know a representative from NASRA, the National Association of State and Retirement Administrators, spoke to the board and had some comparative information on state retirement systems with regard to amortization periods. And I know there was a chart that represented the average period from these state plans over the last several years. It was generally declining, and I want to say that the current average was 24, 25, 26. I'm forgetting, but it was in the mid-20s.
Okay. 24, 25, 26.
Yeah, I apologize. It was part of that presentation that Keith Brainerd gave that I remember seeing. We don't have it as part of our presentation.
Okay, and then I believe it was the League of Cities and CSDA mentioned a couple of things to help mitigate some issues here. So I just want to know what you guys think about it. This is something that they would have to do, which is pre-funding a trust. Oh, you were working with that? Okay.
I was just going to say, currently we don't offer a 115 trust for CalPERS, so that's something that they would have to do outside.
Right. No, I'm aware of that, but I think there's, anyway. Putting in an opt-out. So when we do this, or doing an opt-in early, a tiered system, and and I don't know what he meant by the ramp down. So I just wanted to know what you guys thought about those.
I think he was generally in favor of the changes we were proposing for the ramps. As far as providing a choice to employers, again, the formal proposal that we've put together does not allow a choice on either the length of the period or the date that we adopt these changes. That doesn't mean that the board can't make different choices. Adopting early is not something we are opposed to. It presents a little bit of administrative challenges, particularly if we wanted to do it for the 17 valuations. That would be difficult. But for the 18 valuations, that would be fine, and we're not opposed to offering that option. As far as offering a longer period, again, we would say that becomes your decision. We're recommending 20 years for determining the minimum required contribution. But it comes down to the board's final decision.
Okay.
And maybe a quick comment. In terms of, I think Dorothy had mentioned an early opt-in. Right now, employers have the option of wanting, when we send out the annual vows, we give them what we call a fresh start, where we collapse all the bases into a shorter amortization period. And that's an option right now. And we could possibly look at whether offering an option for them to opt in into the amortization period early. I know Dorothy had mentioned that some of her plans or some of her agencies don't want to wait till 19. And so if you follow the recommendation and implement it as of 19, we might want to consider whether we can actually put that option out there to help employers adopt early if necessary.
Okay.
And make that as an option.
Okay, and Mr. Fechner's nowhere. Okay, so I have a motion on the floor. I'm wondering if we want to do a friendly amendment to an opt-in early. And then I think, go ahead. Oh, Richard, Mr. Costigan.
Madam Chair, I would respectfully suggest that we just move forward with just the separate motion as Mr. Gillihan proposed, and then give staff direction to bring back rather than on the fly. I'm not sure what we'd be voting on as an option. I understand that CSAC and League may have proposed something. I also understand there might have to be a statutory change as it relates to the 115s. So I'm saying I would recommend that the staff bring back us a series of recommendations rather than tying the two together, but that would be my suggestion.
Okay. How does the board feel about that? Okay, go ahead. Ms. Mother?
Just from a timing perspective, if we wanted to offer this opt-in option, that would need to be done fairly quickly, I would imagine. Is that?
That's the problem.
Not right?
If they wanted it really as for the 17 val, the sooner the better. And if they wanted the 17 val, it would probably result in a delay for their vals.
Mm-hmm.
If they're okay with that, then we can have those discussions with those employers. For the 18 vals, that's a year from now. There's plenty of lead-up time. So easily for the 18 opt-in, it's much easier. 17 will be a challenge, and while it is an option, there will have to be a delay for those vals just because we're so far along in the process.
So I guess I would suggest, I don't sit on the committee, but I would suggest that for the opt-in option, where employers could request to have this implemented for them for either the 17 or the 18 year, that be incorporated as part of the motion or a separate motion today, but that the other options, like a 115 pre-funded trust that CalPERS were to administer, or an opt-out provision with criteria that be brought back at a later time, because that requires certainly more fleshing out and more analysis and consideration.
So I will reiterate. Can I make a friendly amendment? Can someone make a? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Richard.
Madam Chair, I made a motion which was seconded, and I would respectfully request that we call the vote.
Sure. Anybody else? All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right. Thank you. The motion passes as is. I would respectfully ask Mr. Toronto, that you go ahead and look at our opt-out or hardship, whatever you want to call it.
Yes, we'll try and work with the employers as they contact us and work on see what we can do to.
And I think you guys are already working with the employers on a trust or a legislation for something like that, or is that not true?
I would have to defer that to.
Okay. There's Brad. Mr. Pacheco, go ahead.
Madam Chair, Brad Pacheco, CalPERS team. You might recall 2 years ago, we explored establishing a 115 trust at the request of our employer partners. After meeting with the stakeholders, we did put that aside for the time being, but it's something that we could bring back because we have done the analysis and looked at it. And Mr. Costigan's correct, it does require legislation, so it would be something that we would have to do during the next cycle.
Okay, that would, we'd like to, I think, if you could bring that back, that would be awesome.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
All right, we're moving on to. So I'm hearing a request to break now while we're between items until 3:15. So I'm going to go ahead and call a break till 3:15. Be back here. Thank you.